Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on your time zone. I want to thank everyone for coming to our panel discussion titled The Dealmaker's Guide to Strategic Partnerships. We will, of course, touch on the topic that is top of everyone's mind, namely, of course, COVID-19, but how it's impacted specifically strategic deal-making, the process, as well as our thoughts on the future. We will be recording this session, and a playback will be available shortly afterwards for those attendees. We're going to discuss the impact that COVID-19 has had and will continue to have in the biopharma deal-making, and we're going to explore the impact of this situation on the strategies of these biopharma companies. We're going to dive into some tactics as well, and with some real-world advice and case studies that the panelists have been working through the last few weeks. We do have 1 hour allotted for the panel, including questions that have been prepared in advance, as well as questions received in advance from participants. If you have any questions that you would like the panelists to address, please submit them through the Q&A system, and I will read out the most frequently asked questions and the ones that have the broadest applicability to the audience at the end. If we do not have time to address your question, fear not, we will follow up separately with our thoughts in writing. I am obliged to share that due to confidentiality obligations and other regulatory requirements, we will not address questions specific to any one company. This is also not considered legal advice or the offer to buy or sell any security. Everything discussed is considered off the record. Without any further ado, I wanted to first thank the panelists who have joined this discussion to share their views on what makes for a successful deal maker in this environment. I will introduce each of them briefly, and then we will jump right into the questions. So, starting with Sara. Sara Solomon is a partner in the Goodwin Technology and Life Science Group based in San Francisco. Sara specializes in licensing, collaborations, and M&A transactions involving biotech, pharma, and other life science companies. She's been recognized as a leading life sciences attorney by various organizations, including the Legal 500, LMG Life Sciences, and the Best Lawyers in America. Welcome, Sara. Chris Ehrlich is Senior Managing Director and Global Head of Biopharma at Locust. He brings significant venture capital, business development, and strategy consulting experience prior to joining Locust almost 7 years ago to the day from InterWest Partners, where he was a general partner. Chris is also based in San Francisco in our San Francisco office. Malcolm Bates is a partner in Goodwin's Technology Life Science Group and based in the other Cambridge across the pond and in London in the UK. He specializes in partnering and other transactions involving European life science companies and has been a partner for 17 years. Malcolm has a PhD in molecular biology, but he will not be answering any science questions, I'm told. That is from Imperial College London, and he was previously General Counsel and Vice President at Genset in Paris. Welcome, guys. Okay, so on to the meat. So us, as well as everyone else on this call, have been locked down for around 2 months, some more, some less, and quarantine is likely to last for at least another month or so, depending on where you're located. So I want to dive into some strategies that folks have used in a couple of situations. So thinking about how to conduct business development outreach in light of the facts that conferences aren't being held, we can talk specifically about how Goodwin and Locust have worked, but I'd also like to understand how that applies to building new relationships and new outreach to potential partners. So Chris, why don't you kick us off on this one?
So thanks for having me, Geoff. Good to be here. Good day, everybody. So I've been thinking a lot about this as we're spending a lot of time mastering Zoom, and some better than others, as you can tell from my lack of virtual background, a lot of time on the phone. I think that what we found is that out of tragedy and crisis comes an interesting opportunity to get close to existing and prospective partners and clients here. And we're spending, like I think a lot of people are, a lot of time on the phone, just reaching out, seeing how people are doing on a personal level, hearing their stories on a professional level. There's a lot of people craving sort of human interaction. And I have found that not since 9/11, after which we all picked up the phone and called our friends, our enemies, made up with everybody to see how people were doing, have I spent this much time connecting with people sort of within our company, outside of our company, with our clients and prospective clients. So really, it's no surprise. There's no handshakes and sitting down at conferences. It's spending a lot of time kind of connecting via the phone and on Zoom.
So Chris, you seem like a pretty gregarious guy. What advice would you give for people who might not be as prone to call someone that there's more of an acquaintance as opposed to someone they know better? Is this something that you're just calling people up? Are you sending a bunch of emails? How are you doing it organically to make it feel real as opposed to contrived?
So from our perspective, we're generating a lot of content, which I think people like to hear about because at least it's novel and it's some thought in a sea of kind of unanswered questions. Um, so I think it's either having the content to share or just reaching out on kind of a personal level to connect with people. And I think the personal connections, since that's what this business is about, usually lead to, hey, while we're at it, maybe you guys could help with this or that, or let me talk about some of the problems you have. Everybody's got a challenge in this environment, so everybody's happy to talk about that. You can just put your phone on mute and leave it at that.
Sarah, what do you think? What's been your experience?
So we've seen an increase in actually doing full negotiations via Zoom, which has been great. We found the process to be actually kind of surprisingly effective. I think that the Zoom negotiations are arguably more efficient when you have someone on video who can't move, who can't walk away, can kind of catch them if they're clearly looking to the side or doing something else. I think it kind of creates a captured audience, and I think it gets everybody to move a little bit quicker. I personally like the Zoom negotiations much better than just your standard conference calls. It's nice to be able to see everybody's faces, see when people want to speak up, have an opportunity to share documents on a screen. I think it really lends to a much more collaborative type of environment. And if you're interested in hearing a really great discussion about consummating a deal under lockdown, I highly, highly recommend the Fireside Chat on the BioCentury podcast that was just released a couple of days ago. It features James Sabry, who's the global head of pharma partnering at Roche, and Mike Gilman, who's the CEO of Arrakis. And they really break down for about 20-25 minutes the entire process of doing the Roche Arrakis deal that was just announced a little bit ago. And most of the definitive agreement was negotiated on Zoom in the early days of the COVID lockdown. So it's a really sort of great line of sight into the inside workings of how that deal came together and worked.
So a little birdie told me that you might have also been involved in that deal. So without revealing anything confidential, is there any insights that we can get without having to spend 25 minutes with Mike Gilman?
So I thought that deal was just really great. It was interesting because we were able to share documents on the screen with each other. We had a WhatsApp conversation going internally on the side. We would sort of negotiate for an hour or two, maybe 3 at the outset, and then take a break down into our little groups and come back and renegotiate. I think we had originally contemplated that everybody would have to sort of fly for these negotiations, and then it would take about 3 days at a time. And I think we would have probably filled the full 3 days if we had done that. And with the Zoom negotiations, I think we cut that 3 days down to about a day and a half. And it was really collaborative and really friendly, and I think a great way to do the deal.
So just one last follow-up on that, and this is actually really interesting because I have not, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, been in that intense situation in our business. So just some tactics. So, you can have sidebar conversations in real time. So you were using WhatsApp or other chats to have those so the other side couldn't see it, and then you can call a timeout if you need it, or what was some of the specific strategies to make sure that you didn't mess something up?
Yeah, so I think you summarized it well. We had a WhatsApp text chain that is still actually going to this day after the deal's even sort of closed down, which is kind of fun to keep up with each other and hear about things that are happening in life and in work. And then, like you said, we tried doing sort of breakout rooms, decided that was a little bit too tenuous to make sure that we were going to do that and not leak back to each other. So we had set up just different lines for Zoom for group negotiations versus our own side negotiating. And then on that deal, we actually swapped in and out parts of the team just based on availability at that point in time. And I think the video and interactions made that a lot easier in order to do that. And even though we had a team in the United States and a team in Europe with the time difference, I think it really worked very well. And I actually think it may simplify things going forward for people and allow for more efficient and I would say equally effective negotiations.
Got it. And for the record, I do like Mike Gilman, so nothing was meant by that comment in case anyone's listening.
He's
And,
fantastic, for sure.
and Malcolm, so I wonder if you have any thoughts, being across the pond, if you've seen a similar type of adoption of the virtual deal, or just how is the European angle playing out relative to relationships, et cetera?
Yes, well, I'd certainly endorse a lot of what Sarah's been saying about conducting deal negotiations. All of that rings very true to me. I wasn't on that particular deal, but used similar techniques on other ones. Certainly, just moving away from deals to the sort of business development side. Been talking a lot with clients about how they've been utilizing it in order to do business development with prospective partners. They've certainly been making much more intensive use of Zoom and other media. I think it doesn't probably make up completely for the face-to-face meetings, but it does some other things very efficiently. It's very good for building relationships in a way that you can't in quite the same way over the phone. Certainly cheaper and much more efficient in some ways. I think the feedback I've had from people who've been doing partnering meetings is that we recently had a meeting in Europe, many people will know about, called Biopharma, and at the last minute they had to switch that to being an entirely online experience. The feedback I've had from clients was that it was pretty good, considering, and a lot of people made an effort to participate, not just over the couple of days, but over the entire week that it was open. And so not a complete substitute, but not an altogether terrible experience, I don't think.
That's interesting. So I'm going to ask each of you, I guess, in light of that, to get out your crystal balls, because this is a wholly different paradigm in deal making, where relationships really do matter. And I've heard from Sara that it works really well, and it sounds like BioEurope did reasonable as well. I guess, Chris, you're a conference commando in many ways. How do you think this is going to impact the future of that initial relationship build, as well as that continuous build where you might not know someone as well, but you got to do that dance? Do you think that there's going to be a permanent change, or it will eventually go back when the restrictions ease up, or what's your thinking about how the mechanics will operate?
So I don't think by any stretch the conference business is going to go away, but I do think that people have gotten a taste of the efficiency of being able to do things in a very quick and efficient manner via video. And I was listening to an advisory panel earlier this week about telemedicine, for example, and how a lot of doctors refused 2 months ago to want to do telemedicine because they felt they had to be with their patients and lay their hand on them. Patients felt they had to go into the doctor's office, and now they're forced, both patients and doctors, to have to do things over video. And after 2 months of it, both patients and doctors says, we're never going back to the crowded waiting rooms and people having to wait and fill out the paperwork. And so will, hospitals and doctors' waiting rooms, be eliminated entirely in the future? No way. Will people now embrace doing kind of more telemedicine? Absolutely. I think it's a great kind of model for where we are, which is, when I would travel to Malcolm's pre-existing conference 6 months ago to BioEurope, it was sort of a long run for a short shoot, because you'd fly 10, 12 hours and you'd go and be up all night, and then you'd go bang through 12 meetings, of which 15 minutes was sort of value added, and have sort of a blur and be tired and write down notes. We can do the same thing right now, just bang through in the video. So even first meetings and doing kind of client discovery needs can be done incredibly efficiently. And so, I certainly, from a Locust Watch perspective, we don't even think as much about conferences. I probably have between 6 and 10 calls a day, a portion of which are all with new companies, and you get to meet and talk and get to do it a lot more regularly. So between the expense and the lack of the savings you get from not having to travel and the ability to actually see people physically, I think that this concept of video outreach and phone conversations with people initially and kind of building relationships going on is going to be very, very much integrated into the BD function going forward.
So I'll leave this topic in a second. I did hear something interesting from a guy from Akamai who maybe has a vested stake in this yesterday, that said that he thinks the next wave is going to be integrating the live in person with the video, where you have some people in the office or at a conference and others that are remote, and understanding how to have the interplay between the two is maybe the next wave once we all get back into the office, which I thought was an interesting perspective to consider. So switching gears just a little bit, I wanted to reference briefly some of the concepts that we put in the white paper on the Locust Walk side as it relates to how public companies think about partnerships and the impact on their stock prices. Those were based upon data that was publicly available, but I thought it would be interesting, just to take a divergence from COVID for a minute, to think about those 6 metrics and the impact that has on the minds and psychology of the CEOs and the boards for private companies, because obviously you can't get data on the impact of those deals on stock prices because it doesn't exist. So there were 6 different metrics that we found, and I want to get each of your guys' take on this so we can try to disaggregate the impact of specific parts of a deal and what you should be thinking about, and then what the impact might have on your company. Obviously, lots of different factors, but just we'll keep that high level. So upfront cash, the dividing land we saw in the public world was $20 million US. Above that, there was a material impact, and below that, it was not. Total cash runway, that if you're extending your cash by 6 months or more, that had an impact, versus on the private side, on the less than 6 months, it did not. Total deal value of 200 million or more had a positive impact on the stock price. Less than 200 did not. If you were licensing your lead asset versus your secondary asset, interestingly, the secondary asset had a much bigger impact on your stock in a good way than the lead asset. Licensing versus co-development, similarly, co-dev was viewed more favorably than a license. Geography, Asia Pac versus global US, I'm sure you could figure that one out. And stage of development, where actually later stage assets did not correlate as well with stock price returns, as opposed to preclinical through phase 2, actually showed real nice benefit to companies for deals that were done during that time window. So just to play those out one at a time, I'm curious what you think about, if you're a private company, the implications of the size of an upfront for a partnership, and does that impact what your strategy is relative to a deal? Do you care about that as much if you're a private company than if you're a public company? So Malcolm, I don't know if you want to take a first crack at that.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly most of my clients are European private venture capital backed biotech companies, mostly drug discovery and development, and we're certainly seeing, you know, I think it's fair to say that European companies generally are less well funded than US companies, and so they probably struggle a little bit more on fundraising, certainly look to find other ways to extend their cash runway. And so I think there's definitely a tendency to look more at front-loaded deals. And I think, you know, in the current environment, that's only going to be accentuated. In relation to deal types, then I think if you're looking at licensing versus co-development, I haven't seen a significant change there. Certainly for private companies, given the general concerns about preserving cash, I'd be surprised if there wasn't a bit of a move away from co-development back to licensing. I think probably the most significant area, though, may be geography. Now, certainly European companies in particular, particularly private ones, have over recent years been looking more and more at doing deals, smaller regional deals with Asian countries, Japan, Korea, but particularly with China, to do deals for China rights, just in order to help with the cash runway. And obviously that has downsides in terms of splitting up the assets, which doesn't always play well with big pharma. But it's certainly an issue which has been in the forefront of companies' minds for several years, and I can only see that being accelerated by COVID-19 and the effect that's likely to have on fundraising and cash runways.
So ultimately, this comes down to cash for you, is what you're thinking. You know, having the ability to finance through partnerships, and you got to do it any way possible. So if you have to license instead of doing a co-pro to get more capital, and you don't have to put as much in downstream, you can defray some of your R&D costs. That's more of a European focus in light of there being less investment dollars, all else equal, available. Is that a fair?
Yeah, and that's a fair summary. I think the other one you mentioned, you know, stage of development, I think is probably too early to see any change there, particularly for private companies. But I think, again, there may be a trend towards earlier licensing for the same sorts of reasons. That was certainly, I think, the whole move from to partnering at an earlier and earlier stage was something that was very much accelerated by the last recession in 2009. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if you saw something very similar now.
Yeah, survive to thrive is something we've talked about in the past, and ultimately, you know, these companies are less concerned about what the public thinks of them as opposed to how much capital they can get to live to fight another day. So that makes a ton of sense, and it's very different than how a public company would approach it.
Yeah.
So, Sarah, you want to give this a shot? There's a lot of things in there, and happy to go into any one of them, but I just think it's important to note the difference between how a private company and a public company approaches this, and if you have any thoughts on any of those different measures.
So on this stage of development, I think in the last couple of years, we've seen a real increase in doing mixed asset deals and really highly structured bespoke deals. I think generally in order to obtain a larger upfront, we're seeing pharmas ask for the lead or the secondary asset, as you had pointed out, but then also asking for additional discovery targets or early discovery or research programs sort of as a sweetener to make sure that there is some sort of return on the investment. We're definitely seeing an uptick in requests for both follow-on compounds and backup compounds to sort of ensure the success of the partnership where possible, and to justify the larger upfronts, that if people are going to be paying for them, they want to make sure that at least one of the compounds gets through, even if that means additional research or preclinical development needs to be done. And I think, you know, for later stage asset deals, we're still seeing our biotech licensors, you know, look for the same sort of co-development rights, co-promotion, co-commercialization rights, and profit shares to retain some sort of meaningful rights, with the thought that even though those rights are being secured today, by the time they're actually exercisable, hopefully we're on the other side of this pandemic and on the other side of being able to raise capital in order to finance those activities. And so I think there's still an interest in retaining those sort of meaningful rights, with a hope that in 3 or 4 years, as these assets are progressing, that there's going to be money that can be raised in order to have those sort of increased participation rights, and sort of on the public company side, at least the uptick theoretically, and the stock price that goes with that. I do think that we're probably asking for more opt-out rights or sort of conversion rights in the event that our clients decide that they can't really continue to participate in the co-development sharing, or don't really want to build out a full commercial infrastructure in order to do things. But I think people are still looking for that flexibility, and are still hopeful that by the time they actually exercise those rights, we'll be in a slightly different market and environment, and our clients will be able to really take advantage of those rights in the deals. Interesting.
So before I get to you, Chris, I think, you know, what I would say, at least what I'm seeing and reflecting on what both Sara and Malcolm are saying, is based on where you are in your company's life cycle from a capitalization perspective will determine or impact how aggressive you can be or how successful you will be on partnering. That's maybe motherhood and apple pie, something you would expect naturally, but in this environment, those who are well capitalized we're seeing more competition for the deals and better terms on those situations. So in Europe, if you're trying to raise capital from deal making, they know you're in a financial pickle. That is harder to get better deal terms. Paradoxically, if they already had the money, they don't need it, then you probably wouldn't have to license as much, and you can be more selective and think more like a public company. So it's kind of return to the haves versus have-nots is kind of what I would say is maybe the synthesis of what both of you have been sharing. So Chris, last but not least, any incremental thoughts that you'd like to add on that?
I think, yeah, so it is motherhood and apple pie that if you have cash, you don't need cash. But I think the bigger issue now is that probably most of the people that are listening are ones that want to access more capital that weren't so lucky to take in money during the robust month of January, say. And so what we're finding is a couple things. One is companies throw all options on the table, public versus private. The publics, can generally raise money if they want to. The privates are struggling. And there's a lot of uncertainty relative to when timelines will open up for clinical trials to generate data, which will lead to milestones to be able to finance. There's a lot of uncertainty as to, is there going to be an IPO market? And if so, will it be robust? And without an IPO market, then there's the question of, will there be crossovers? And if there's no crossovers, then you're back to the same list of 20 venture capitalists that we dealt with 7 years ago. And so I am finding that in an era of uncertainty, everything is on the table, and that the private companies are much more open to explore every option. And I think that they're not in dollar maximization mindset. I've even found some existing clients saying, hey, someone's interested in partnering with me. Do you want to do work on that? And the question is, sure, but to do it the right way, you got to open that up and do an expansive outreach. No, we don't want to do that. We don't want to waste the time. If we can save our company by taking one deal with high certainty, we'll take a small amount of dollars because the cost of capital theoretically is lower to us, giving away a lot of the company. So I think people are pretty stressed out about the uncertainty of the environment here, and why we see activity both on the private public financing side and the deal side. People are looking for where the water is higher. And so if you listen to what Malcolm is saying, I think people are looking to China, for example, because it's far more open than any place now because of the business climate. I think there's a lot of activity there. We're doing 2 deals in China right now that we're trying to close, even more so than Japan. So Europe, US, Israeli companies are all looking to find where the source of capital is. And right now, it's probably more in China than any place that I've seen.
Interesting. And we're going to punt on the obvious follow-up about the capital markets, because we're going to try to keep this focused on partnering. But hopefully we can address that maybe in a separate discussion. But maybe just to piggyback on your comment about China, Chris, and just in general ex-US deal making. There was a question actually on the screen, but something we also were thinking about, is Europe regional deals, is that something that is a renewed interest? Is there any way of selling things? We used to talk about Japan, sleeves off the vest, which is one of the reasons I wore my vest today, where you're not using the sleeves anyway, so you might as well sell it. Is that something that is more or less popular now? And how do you think about those types of deals in a COVID or frankly, a post-COVID world? Maybe why don't you pick up from there, Chris, since you were on a roll, and we'll toss it to the other guys.
So my experience has been not a lot of appetite for the US, Japanese, or Chinese clients we have for specific European regional partnering, and it's been pretty consistently not that way for certainly the 7 years that I've been here and throughout my venture career, more due to kind of the higher hurdles of the regulatory burden and the pricing challenges over there. And so I don't necessarily see an uptick anticipated now, or for any rational reason why people would want to go parcel out rights to Europe for any reason.
So Malcolm, what do you think about that? Is Europe a bad place to do a regional deal? I think you're on mute. There you go.
Apologies. Yeah, I agree. We don't normally see that. I mean, people are so focused on the US market. They're focused on the Asian rights or Chinese rights for the reasons I've discussed. But if they've got a a greater asset, maybe in later stage clinical trials. European companies are certainly still looking primarily to the US. They're looking at, if they can, co-commercialization rights in the US and maybe less so in other territories. But I would agree with Chris on his take about European rights per se.
Yeah, and it's interesting is that some of the regional deals take longer to do and you get much less capital. So the thinking, and this is something I've certainly seen, is that, well, why would I want to spend the time if it's not going to impact my situation in the short run? I'd rather either raise capital or do a different deal than try to do perhaps a deal in Japan, which, you know, there still is interest there, but we're seeing less intensity than perhaps in the past. Sarah, anything further to add there, or do you want to move on to the next?
I'll just say I think the one thing that we are seeing that is a little bit new with COVID-19 related deals outside of the United States. We're seeing a lot of people starting to look at opportunities to source raw materials or do manufacturing outside of the United States. And I think, as you pointed out earlier, you know, given some of the slowdown around clinical trials in the United States or some early chemistry work or preclinical development work that would normally happen in the United States that may be difficult to do in certain regions because folks are shut down. I think there is an opportunity for people to look at working with CROs and considering what they can do with different companies outside of the United States to keep their timelines as close to the original plan as possible.
Got it. So you brought us back to COVID, so I'll blame that on you. But I'll piggyback off of that just to be fair. In previous webinars we've done, we talked about COVID deal making, and is that where does that stand? How interesting is it? And everyone's probably seen this in March and even in April. A lot of companies were pivoting their technologies, their platforms, their products into a COVID indication of all different varieties, both public and private companies. I guess the question now that it's May 7th and we're starting to see things open up, I'm pleased to announce that Massachusetts opened their golf courses today, so we can see a light at the end of the tunnel. Hopefully you all have similar type improvements where you're located. But where are we in the COVID deal-making cycle? Is it the wave that's already gone ashore and it's starting to recede? Is there still a strong need? What are you guys seeing relative to that shift? Has everyone already made their bets? So Chris, I'll let you kick that one off.
So this is obviously a terrible disease and very unfortunate. Never have we in our lifetime experiencing something, you know, like this. So I'm not going to belittle the consequences, but I think my gut is that now we have some more perspective on the long-term viability of the products in this space and the deals that are happening. And so from my perspective, there's kind of a lot of smoke and light surrounding COVID deal making we've talked about and dedicated a whole webinar to, but not a lot of heat being generated. So obviously there's a significant unmet need here, but the landscape of when these will become available de facto is going to be sort of more in the future, and that's very uncertain. And so what I'm seeing is lots of very small bets being placed. And so I did some research this morning to kind of look at the facts to see if I could back that up, and there's sort of good news and bad news. Since February of this year, which is not that far ago, there have been 64 coronavirus collaborations announced, and that surpasses all antiviral collaborations that have been done in the past decade in basically a couple of weeks. So that's pretty impressive, and you could look and say, that's a lot of activity. Are there opportunities for people to make a lot of money, and are there going to be winners come out of that? I think when you look closer at the activity, what you're seeing is that a great number of the deals involve academic institutions, and at least so far, the announced payments that you're seeing for these deals are pretty minor. And we're certainly seeing that with our own client base. And so I would say, both given the competitive nature, which is great for patients because there's lots of activity, you know, of the arena, and the fact that, you know, the government is a monopsonistic buyer here, and we know that they're going to be pretty aggressive relative to how they're going to price anything they take on. So there's going to be a lot of pressure. I'm not super optimistic about the long-term financial prospects for companies developing these assets. So my perspective is that there'll be lots of grant funding, lots of small investments by large pharma, but not a lot of financial winners in the long term.
Okay, Sarah or Malcolm, you guys are on the other side of the fence from us. You probably have a pretty broad purview given your significant client base. Do you, either of you have a view you want to share on that.
I'm happy to go first. I mean, certainly, I agree with Chris that there may not be a huge amount of money to be made directly in relation to COVID-19 products and during the pandemic period. But there has been just over the last couple of months an incredible number of deals and an incredible amount of activity, and obviously lawyers have been running around trying to put these deals in place, us included. And that's not just vaccines, it's drugs, it's testing technologies, both nucleic acid and antibodies. And they're being done really quickly. And I think what's really interesting is you're seeing a lot of strategic investors of different types. So whether they be pharmaceutical companies, big biotechs, big diagnostic companies, but also the largest CROs and CMOs, they're coming in and looking to leverage their resources and their cash, which they have in abundance, and trying to do deals to access assets and technologies. And they're not looking just in relation to the immediate period of the pandemic. They're in many cases looking to leverage their position to do deals which extend beyond the pandemic period to sort of endemic and seasonal use in the case of vaccines, or to more widespread use of testing technologies in the case of DNA or antibody tests. And so there's been a huge amount of activity. A lot of those deals, because they extend beyond just the pandemic period, I think will last the pass the test of time. Some of them won't. Some of them will not succeed. Some of them will fall over. But I can well imagine that it will have a significant effect on who many of these smaller companies are allied with and have long-term relationships with over many years to come. I think it'll be quite significant.
Sarah, what do you think?
So personally, I've seen a huge uptick in deal making, both on COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 specific deals, and then just other deals as well. We've definitely seen deals come together in sort of what I would consider record time. I've done deals in a couple of days. I've done deals in a week that would normally have taken 8 to 10 weeks easily, or even more time. In a normal situation, I think people are willing to come together and get really focused and do a deal really quickly. I agree with Chris that the sort of amounts of compensation or the economics on these deals that are specific to COVID-19 are not huge, but I, candidly appreciate that people are looking to find ways to put good science to use and help out patients without necessarily needing to make a huge profit associated with that. But at the same time, still seeing amazing deals getting done, inside of oncology, inside of I&I. And I think, for those other deals that are still happening, I think there is an advantage to those companies being a little bit later stage with more data to show in order to do the deals. I think data, just like cash, is king in these situations. We definitely have seen pharmas come in and try to push down upfront payments or overall compensation on deals that have been, in negotiation for a few months pre-COVID and then into now. And those companies that have really rock solid data or cash on their balance sheet to be patient have been able to keep those upfronts where they started and continue to do deals on the original terms. But I do think that there's probably an advantage to companies that are doing their second or their third partnering deal as opposed to their first, and sort of showing that their platform works or that their science has been validated elsewhere. And I think that given what we're seeing with deals like the Alnylam Blackstone deal, like there are really amazing transformative deals that are still getting done even in this time that will really change the trajectory of a company going forward. post this pandemic.
Got it. So maybe just to put a bookmark in the COVID stuff, there was actually a question online that I was just going to ask anyways. To piggyback off of what Chris said, what we're seeing at least, and I guess what is the instinct that we're kind of going towards anyways, is that the big companies are tending to do deals with other big companies. Governments like to work with big pharmas. We've heard that repeatedly. That's why you're not seeing too many folks. I mean, Moderna is now a big company. They're called a $20 billion market cap or thereabouts. So the ability for a small player to get a major deal and a major grant or anything else right now is becoming more challenging. And what we're hearing at least is that you really need more data. We might have a second wave of deals perhaps to see once these early ones kind of plow through if they work or not, but kind of have some clinical efficacy data or data in another indication that can be more transferable over, and that'll actually improve your odds of getting a COVID-19 deal. But it's definitely, while there's a lot of activity, it's certainly not evenly distributed amongst big and small companies. There's definitely winners and losers in that lot. By some nods, I think that I'm getting some agreement on. Cool. So getting a little tactical, but also some practical advice for the audience. There's a lot of things someone can do if you're looking to do BD deals. And what would be your recommendation on how people today should be spending their time? Should you consider starting a new process? Should you just focus on deals that are closer to completion? Should you wait until all of this stuff stops and then people come out of their foxholes? Give everyone a framework on how to think about kind of the next best activity for what we should be thinking about as deal makers. So, Chris, do you want to kick us off there? Then we'll go to Sara.
Yeah, there's no obvious answer. I mean, in the calls that I have all the time with folks, they say, good thing I have enough money. The first thing people talk about is, I have runway until blank. Okay, that's great. And so anything, and what they want you to know is, I could always use more, but I'm not sure I can get it. So I'm not looking to spend money and divert myself now. Then the second thing they say is, I need some. So when I ask, how can I be helpful? And the answer is, can you go get clinical trials restarted? No. So, okay, so that's a challenge. Once we've established that those two are out there, I think people are somewhat paralyzed relative to what they should be doing because they have this giant period of uncertainty relative to the clinical trials being started again and generating data. So many of the conversations I have, whether it's on the buy side or the sell side, people have a lot of enthusiasm, and then they go back to their boards, and the boards say, stop doing pretty much everything. Don't look for cheap assets. Don't look to actually run a process right now. And if you do, make it a very truncated one, because we don't want to kind of be out there overexposing our assets. So everything that people would do on the sell side is very short and crisp to see if there's interest, and on the buy side is slowing down or taking some time because people are worried about spending money on the process and spending money on others. I think that what people are probably interested in is, are there pockets globally where you can take advantage of the ability to start your trials, as we talked about before this? Can I go to Australia and run trials? Can I go to Eastern Europe and run some trials? Can I go to China and run some trials? Are there pockets of strategic interest or capital that in the short term I can get? So I know from a Locust Walk perspective, we're doing a bunch of stuff in China. We're looking at investors in China because they're the first to come back to the table. We're looking at strategics in China, even though the deals are small, because they're active, as opposed to, say, Japan, where we spent a lot of time in the previous couple of years. Everybody wanted a validating deal, but the 6 to 9 to 12 months it takes to get those deals doesn't help anybody this year. So I think the question is, what can you do for me now? What can I do that's going to happen in 2020 that's meaningful to me to bring me more cash, since the uncertainty exists relative to the visibility on when I can restart my trials or when I can go raise more money.
So Sara, what would you say people should be thinking about right now?
I think all options should be on the table. I think you have to be looking at both partnering and fundraising. And if you're looking at fundraising, you have to look at all options of fundraising. If you're a public company, you need to be thinking about, can you go to the public markets? If you've got good data, is there an opening there? Can you do a PIPE? Can you do a convertible debt offering? We've seen an unusual uptick in convertible debt offerings for life sciences companies in a way that we haven't historically seen. Can you go get grant money? Can you work with a partner who wants to do an equity investment and take advantage of some strategic investment money coming in? How can you find a way to work with your partner to share costs or find a way to do something in the future? What are your deal sweeteners that you can add in to make sure that you have an opportunity to do a deal that doesn't just last a year or two, but has maybe a longer collaboration term, so that you have an opportunity to get sort of past the current environment and start generating the data that you need, or to generate the asset interest that'll allow for an option deal to work. I see a question from one of our attendees asking, is this a good time for platform companies with existing data? Absolutely. If you can show up with multiple targets and do a multi-target deal, this is a great time. The more targets that you can do, the more shots on goal you have, and the more I think a pharma can be interested in finding a way to work with you. So I think there's a lot of options, but I think they all have to be on the table, and companies should pursue them all at the same time, because I don't know what is going to work a week from now versus a month from now versus 6 months from now.
Yep. Malcolm, what should people do right now?
Well, I agree with everything that's said there, but I think, if I can talk a little bit anecdotally to what my clients have been saying. I think those that are not able to get into the labs are really just focusing on communication. If they've got data and they that sometimes in relation, if they're COVID related, they're taking the opportunity to get exposure for their technologies and their data by engaging with the various interested parties which we discussed. Otherwise, if it is unrelated to COVID, I think they're spending a lot of time talking to their existing investors. They're spending time talking to those pharma companies who have been either have already reviewed their data or new potential partners. So there's a lot of things they can be doing, and I think they've got a lot of time to do it because they're in most part working from home, and I think they're just focusing on communication.
Interesting. So one of the things that I've, just to piggyback off of that I've noticed is that there are a lot of public companies in the, call it, under 750 million market cap space, which is actually the area that we focused on in the white paper, but that are actually contemplating doing partnering deals as a source of capital because they don't want to raise follow-on capital. They're far beyond the need for a PIPE, but they don't like their stock price, so they're not doing a follow-on. But the flip side of that, which is really interesting, and we're seeing this on a deal we're actually working with Goodwin on a crossover where there's tremendous appetite for companies that are still preclinical, don't have to worry about the clinical data that Chris mentioned. They're not encumbered by data, as they say. But they're actually seeing a renewed interest by crossovers to actually get those things funded, where companies which usually would have an easier time raising capital are finding they actually don't want to do so. It's a very interesting world that things are kind of flipped upside down, where there's paradoxically more liquidity in a weird way for certain types of private companies than there are for public, or maybe it's just a function of the public companies don't want that liquidity. So just maybe some food for thought for there. Any reaction to that, or any further thoughts on that topic? Cool. So maybe I'll just move on briefly. There was a couple questions on the board about oncology deal making, because that's kind of one of the areas that it's a very serious disease and people still need to get therapies and treatments during this outbreak. And so I'm curious what you guys are seeing from a landscape perspective relative to oncology deal making, whether it's impacting terms, speed, is there still interest in it? Sara, I'll let you go first if you like on this one.
So I guess I'll say I've seen two different things, and I'll kind of answer in both directions. I've got an oncology deal right now that is basically an auction deal that has multiple pharmas that are interested in it. And I think one of the biggest issues for the client is trying to make sure that they're going to be able to hit their timelines that they're expecting, that it's sort of difficult to figure out how to get through the clinical trial as planned. and that there's a little bit of nervousness around enrollment and timelines in general and how that's all going to work. But I still think that the deals are getting done. On the other hand, I think people also find oncology assets to be really valuable. And so I do see field splits coming out where a particular target may be good for a non-oncology type of indication, and the client wants to keep the oncology indication, thinking that in a different environment and a year or so from now when there's more data, that they may be able to get better deal terms and economics if they hold on to the program for a little bit longer. So one of the ways that our clients are sort of addressing that is to start doing field splits or target splits in order to enable the flexibility and maybe allow the clients to do the deal twice, if you will, in the right environment for the right part of the asset.
Well, that was usually never possible. So how does that work? I'm just curious.
It's highly complicated. We started doing them. I think you're exactly right that historically there's been a hesitancy in doing those sort of things. We have done a number of target split or field split deals in the last couple of years, and there's a lot of things that you need to think about as far as making sure that you're splitting up the patents and the products and the target in the right way and allowing for coordination across internal versus partnered programs. But it's definitely something that is possible to do, and we've seen a lot of success in clients deciding to pursue that, in that they are able to make sure that there's enough diligence on both sets of the fields moving forward. And if they can't get a partner to move the oncology asset forward in this time, if they keep it, there's an opportunity to sort of wait and make sure that there's diligence either by themselves or from a different pharma company in the future. We have a lot of clients who like to sell their assets twice, and so I think there's an opportunity for people to do that now.
Interesting. So one more follow-up, I promise, then I'll get off this topic. So I'm going to put you on the spot further, Sarah. So I can definitely see in cell therapy where you can have multiple different antigens and you can combine them in certain ways that you can target specific cancer types. So you're saying you're seeing that in small molecule antibody, or is it more in the next gen type products where you might have more targeted therapies in any case?
So I've done field splits in small molecules and antibodies, in RNA, and starting to see it in other types of, sort of more recent assets. I'll probably be vague there to make sure that I don't give away which Goodwin clients are currently looking at things, but we're seeing it across all different types of modalities. I don't think it's specific to any particular one.
Got it. Chris, any thoughts on kind of the oncology landscape that you'd want to share?
So yeah, I think there's three flavors of having an oncology asset or assets to partner. There's ones with existing data, which, let's step back, and oncology has been the majority of deal making and strategic side for the past 5 years or so. So if you have an asset with data that's unpartnered, people worry about what's wrong with it. So those are tricky. If you have an asset that's preclinical, it's really a question of sort of proximity to an IND, which is an interesting sweet spot because people will take it. They don't have to worry about 6 months delay, 9 months delay. They're buying it based on preclinical data and they'll go. I think the bigger challenge is the ones that are stuck in the middle. And again, most of my conversations have to do with, well, I need 80 patients for an interim. I got 60 patients and I hope I get 20 more, but I kind of preserve to get that. I don't see a lot of people doing a lot of deals either on the buyer or the seller side for people who are stuck in this limbo. So my hypothesis is that you're either going to see kind of people looking for value shopping over in Asia, particularly China, for those that are stuck, or the deals that that are higher profile are going to be kind of preclinical deals, either platform multi-target ones or ones that are at IND stage.
Makes sense. And anything further to add to that, Malcolm? And maybe think about, I guess maybe one of the following questions that I saw in the chat room was the idea of platform companies with strong preclinical data. Is that helpful? And just to piggyback on Chris's response, you're not encumbered by data. And so if you can get in the right space, that feels like an interesting area where we're seeing partner interest as well as strategic interest, and certainly no delays from clinical trials because there are no clinical trials for a preclinical asset. That's the beauty of it. We are rapidly running out of time. I want to give a minute to each of you guys. I like to end these on a positive note. So if you guys wouldn't mind sharing just in a brief, 30 seconds to a minute, your final thoughts on how deal making is going to change in the future in a positive way. I know we talked about this a little bit, but what's in store, and how does it help us as an industry and as society? So Sarah, ladies first.
So I personally feel incredibly lucky to be working during this period. It's been sort of amazing to be able to share with my kids that I work in an essential business, and I don't know that we necessarily thought lawyers were essential, and there's probably plenty of people who don't think they are necessarily, but I think this crisis has motivated people and companies to find new ways to collaborate, and that's exciting to be a part of. I've done both COVID and non-COVID deals during this time, and it's really interesting to see, technology being brought into these deals, and different sorts of ways that deals are being financed. And personally, I'm incredibly hopeful for the future, and I think that there may be some really great lessons learned in connection with having to do all of these deals on Zoom, or further apart, where people are starting to appreciate what it is that they have, what they can do, and then I think it may really launch us into a new cool trajectory for deal making in the future.
Cool. Chris, any final words you'd like to leave us with?
So I think in general, something that I heard recently just about the industry is that I think if anybody's going to save the world relative to COVID, it's going to probably come from biotech, and it's probably going to come from biotech. And one of the two background screens, or the threes we see around here, it's going to come from the UK, San Francisco, or Boston. And that when college kids, come out of school, if they ever get back to school, instead of rushing off to Menlo Park for technology, they're going to want to go to the heroes in biotech. So I'm enthused, like Sarah, about being associated with it. I guess, as I said before, from a deal-making perspective, I think people are going to really appreciate the efficiencies they've seen in the system, and it's going to save BD professionals a lot of time and a lot of expense and a lot of travel hassles by doing deals going forward in the future.
And last and certainly not least, Malcolm, any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think whether it will have a lasting effect remains to be seen, I think, but I'm incredibly encouraged by and just energized by the speed at which not just companies, but also investors and CROs and CMOs and advisors have all kind of stepped up to the plate. I mean, it's really been quite an amazing experience the last couple of months. I mean, we've certainly been. I've been busier than I've been in many years, and I always thought I was pretty busy already. But so that's been really great, and I just think it's striking just how adaptable people can be when they're under pressure. If you think what you're able to achieve from your own living room or kitchen table, that's really quite inspiring.
Awesome. Well, I'm in the same boat, and I'm inspired by the three of you. I really appreciate all of you getting on and your opinions, and of course to everyone who joined the webinar. Unfortunately, we are out of time. One is just give a quick reminder to everyone that there'll be a link sent out with the recording. It'll be sent to each participant, and if we did not get to your question, which I know we didn't tackle them all, we'll do our best to answer them in writing, hopefully by Monday. That's been our track record so far. So we look forward to seeing you all, hopefully in person soon. In the interim, please stay safe and keep your social distance for now, and continue to do the great work that we and our industry does. So thanks, everyone, and have a great day.